I'm Nora Bennett, 33, and the last week of December in Miami should have been noise and laughter and faces pressed close to the glass for fireworks. But my phone lit up instead with a short message that made the room go quiet. This year we're keeping it cozy. Just Paige's side, my mother wrote, and the words sat there like frost on a window you can't see through. I read them once, then again, as the late sun stretched a silver path across Biscayne Bay outside my apartment. A calm reply rose before the ache could two simple words, Happy New Year, and I hit send. No argument, no question marks, no reminders of how many times we'd done this dance. I set the phone face down and listened to the air conditioner hum, steady as a heartbeat. What they didn't know was that I no longer stood where they had left me. Miles south across water the color of dark glass, there was a place with my name on the deed and a bell at the dock that only I could ring. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to build your own seat at the table, tap like and subscribe, so this story finds the folks who need it. I grew up on the Gulf side of Florida, in a quiet stretch of clear water, where summer evenings smelled like cut grass and charcoal smoke, and the oak trees made long shadows over driveways chalked with hopscotch squares. My parents, Thomas and Elaine, believed in being gracious hosts, crisp table linens, and a house that looked ready for a magazine photo at any moment. We said thank you, we wrote notes on heavy stationery, and we kept family troubles off the front porch. Those values lived beside others, just as firm appearances first page second, and everything else finding its place around that orbit. I was the girl who stacked extra plates, who fetched a jacket for a chilly guest, who learned to fold napkins into perfect fans while my sister practiced her introductions for rooms that would tilt toward her on sight. Money hovered like a cent you couldn't name. My father's success meant we never worried about the light bill, yet he kept score in ways not measured in dollars. In Clearwater, our street was modest. Most families drove the same vehicles for years and handed down bikes with new chains and a fresh coat of paint. But when we moved east to a larger house near Fort Lauderdale for Paige's school opportunities, the contrast felt loud. There were country club fundraisers and sun-bleached lawns kept tight by crews that came on Tuesdays, and a kind of brightness that asked you to try on a smile before you walked through the door. I learned to tuck my small world into quieter corners, a shelf of ocean books, a jar of shells labeled by beach and tide, a bulletin board pinned with maps of the Keys. At dinner, I could talk about coral nurseries for exactly one question long. After that, the conversation drifted toward debate tournaments and which alumni luncheon might help Paige next spring. I found my footing in places that didn't need applause to count, sitting on a pier at dusk with a notebook balanced on my knees, or knee-deep in calm water, helping a volunteer crew anchor new coral fragments to a nursery line. The sea made a kind of sense that rooms full of compliments never did. Current met rock-shaped current, and everything had a reason. At home, New Year's Eve became the calendar square that held our family's center of gravity. The living room filled with neighbors and clients, silver balloons winked against the ceiling, and champagne flutes lined up like soldiers. People arrived expecting a story they already knew. Paige in a dress that caught the light, my mother with a toast, my father's hand at the small of my sister's back, guiding her toward the circle that mattered. I learned to anticipate the pivot, the moment when a conversation would drift away from my project or my lab shift and turn toward phone videos of a speech, a ribbon cutting a smiling portrait under a banner that didn't have room for two names. I don't think anyone meant harm in the beginning. It was simpler than that. Paige fit the rooms my parents loved, and I fit the ones with less noise, and over time those preferences hardened into roles we couldn't step out of without feeling impolite. Still, patterns leave marks. When you're the person refilling the bowl instead of passing it, your hands memorize the weight of the ladle, and your eyes learn the back routes from kitchen to table, without looking up to see who's clinking glasses. I told myself it was fine that I liked the work and the quiet, that keeping things smooth was its own kind of gift. But the body records what the mind edits out. I knew it when my chest tightened at the sight of a text thread with my mother's name, when I caught myself waiting for an invitation to breathe. By the time I finished college, the tide was pulling me south and seaward. I took a job in Miami that let me split time between the lab and the water building sensors and models that taught us how coastlines move and how storms behave. The pay was lean, the hours long, and most nights I came home with salt in my hair and a dinner that could be made in one pan, but I felt useful. Brick by brick, project by project, I built a life that didn't need a guest list to prove it was real. It wasn't ambition, so much as relief, the quiet, sturdy kind that comes from doing what your hands know and sleeping hard because the day asked everything you had to give. And still, every late December, that group text would arrive like a clock striking the same hour. This year, when the message landed and the room dipped, I didn't pace or rehearse arguments in my head. I opened the window, let the evening air in, and looked south past the grid of city lights toward a darker horizon only I could read. There was a dock with new pilings that smelled like clean wood after rain, and a front door that faced the open water, and a bell that answered only to my pull. I had kept that place quiet because I needed it to be mine before it belonged to anyone's story but my own. The text on my screen did not feel like an ending. It felt like a line being drawn between what I used to accept and what I would allow now. And while the city sparked to life around me, I found myself wondering how many people I loved were standing on their own cold thresholds, watching their names slide off lists they used to long for. I picked up the phone again not to argue, but to make a different kind of list, one that would change where the next countdown would be heard and who would be counted in. I was 10 when I began to notice how every introduction in our house carried a quiet hierarchy. "This is Paige, our bright, beautiful girl," my mother would say with a smile that stretched like sunlight. And then almost as an afterthought, "And this is her sister Nora." The words landed soft, but they stayed. You learn early how the tone of a room can tell you where you stand, and in ours the spotlight never drifted far from Paige. She had our mother's eyes and my father's easy charm, and people seemed to orbit her without effort. I learned to keep my hands busy, to set tables, refill bowls, fold napkins, and stay out of the way. Our home in Clearwater glowed each December, decked in silver garland and polished glassware, ready for my parents' annual New Year's Eve party. The guests always arrived early, bringing laughter and bottles of champagne, while I lingered by the kitchen door, watching the lights reflect off the windows. Every year I promised myself I'd join the countdown with everyone else. Yet somehow, I always ended up behind the scenes, wiping spills or running platters back to the counter before anyone noticed the plates were empty. My father would raise his glass as the crowd shouted, "Happy New Year, Paige," because even then they found a way to make it about her. The first time I heard the toast, I laughed quietly, assuming it was a mistake. But by the third or fourth year, the pattern was clear. It was never a mistake at all. By high school, the differences between us were more than just how people spoke our names. Paige was outgoing, graceful, a cheer captain with a circle of friends that trailed her like the tail of a kite. I was quieter, drawn to water more than mirrors collecting seashells, and sketching coral shapes in the margins of my notebooks. I wanted to study marine science, maybe even protect the reefs along Florida's coast one day. When I told my parents, they smiled politely. My father said, "That's sweet, honey. You've always liked the beach." Then he turned to Paige to discuss her debate team and summer program at a university prep camp. I remember sitting there, my voice fading as easily as the hum of a ceiling fan. When I was 16, I baked a lemon tart for the New Year's party, hoping for a small moment of recognition. I spent the afternoon whisking the curd, arranging thin slices of lemon in a pattern I'd practiced 3 times before. As the guests gathered, I waited for anyone to notice. My father's voice cut through the noise, announcing Paige's acceptance into a top college prep program. Cheers erupted, glasses clinked, and my tart sat untouched on the counter. I cut myself a small slice when the room emptied, the sweet tang lingering in my mouth, sharper than the sting in my throat. Somewhere between those quiet moments, I began to understand that being invisible was safer than hoping to be seen. When I was 17, my father took a new job in Fort Lauderdale, and we moved into a bigger house closer to the beach. He called it a fresh start, but it was really just a grander stage for the same show. Paige was enrolled in one of the best private schools in the county, while I was told I could make do with whatever program was available for my grade level. That year, I won a regional science fair for my project on coral restoration, something that meant everything to me. My parents congratulated me with a distracted smile and told me not to stay up too late. A few minutes later, they were talking about Paige's upcoming formal dance and whether her new dress needed alterations. I learned to take pride quietly storing my victories in silence. Paige never rubbed it in. She didn't have to. Her laughter filled every space that belonged to her, and somehow the room always felt lighter when she entered. I envied her without wanting to. She simply lived in the world our parents built for her while I lived in its shadow. But even in those shadows, I found peace under the open water. I joined a small marine club that met on weekends and helped monitor coral health along the coast. The instructors called me diligent, the kind who noticed details others missed. For the first time, I felt useful in a way that didn't need applause. The last New Year's Eve before I left home plays in my memory like an old film reel. Paige was in the living room surrounded by her friends, her laughter carrying over the hum of conversation. I stood in the kitchen, the smell of citrus and sugar mixing with champagne. Midnight struck, and the living room erupted with cheers. My parents raised their glasses, shouting to Paige as confetti rained over her hair. I leaned against the counter, my apron still dusted with flour, and looked out the window toward the dark water beyond the backyard. It was beautiful in a lonely way, the kind of beauty you feel but can't share. That night after the guests left, I walked down to the dock barefoot, the planks cool against my feet. The water shimmered under the moonlight, steady and endless. Somewhere deep down, I promised myself that one day I'd build a life where I wasn't waiting to be chosen. It didn't come from anger, it came from the simple need to breathe without shrinking first. I didn't know what it would look like, or how I'd get there. I just knew it wouldn't involve standing behind another closed door listening to someone else's name in every toast. When graduation came, I packed my car with boxes of books, notebooks filled with sketches of coral, and one old seashell I'd kept since I was 5. My parents posed for pictures, smiling like they always did, proud of the family image they'd maintained. My mother whispered, "Don't forget to call the same way she might remind me to take an umbrella." As I backed out of the driveway, Paige waved from the porch sunlight bouncing off her hair, and I remember thinking that she would always belong to that house, while I would belong to the road ahead. The first apartment I rented near Gainesville was small, barely big enough for a desk, a bed, and a shelf. But I loved it. I studied environmental engineering, diving into coursework that felt alive with purpose. I spent hours in labs learning to measure salinity, monitor tides, and chart erosion. The smell of salt water became part of me, a familiar thread that reminded me of home without the ache. I learned to fix what was broken piece by piece. Maybe that's why I kept going even when every experiment failed before it worked. Every New Year's after that, I kept my phone on silent. The texts still came: photos of Paige at parties, my parents smiling under golden banners, messages that said, "Wish you were here." But I didn't reply anymore. I'd stopped waiting for a seat at their table. I built my own, even if it was just a folding one beside a desk stacked with research papers. I told myself that one day I'd celebrate New Year's on my terms. Not as someone's afterthought, but as someone who had earned her place in the world she built with her own hands. Looking back now, those early years were a slow burn that shaped everything that came later. The long silences, the overlooked victories, the quiet resolve, they became the blueprint for what I would do next. I didn't know it then, but every unnoticed moment was laying the groundwork for the night that would change everything. A night when the toasts would no longer belong to one name alone. A night when I would prove that being left off the list could be the very thing that set me free. Leaving home after graduation felt like walking out from under a ceiling that had been pressing down for years. Gainesville was humid and full of mosquitoes, but the air tasted freer somehow. I lived in a one-room apartment where the walls were thin and the floor creaked when I walked, but I loved every inch of it. My days started early with classes that pushed me to think, and ended late in the lab, where I often fell asleep next to stacks of data sheets. Marine engineering didn't offer glamour or comfort, but it gave me something my family never had: purpose that was mine alone. During those years, my world narrowed to textbooks, research equipment, and long drives to the Gulf Coast for fieldwork. My professor introduced me to a graduate researcher named Michael Torres, who became one of the first people to take my ideas seriously. He was patient, a few years older, always scribbling equations on napkins when we ate lunch near the docks. "You're seeing the future," he told me once after reviewing my notes on coastal sensors. "You just need the right framework to make it work." His words stayed with me, echoing in moments when I thought of giving up. By the time I earned my degree, I was more confident in seawater chemistry than in small talk. Paige, meanwhile, had graduated with a law degree, her photos filling our parents' holiday cards. I didn't expect recognition, but there were days when silence from home felt heavier than criticism. When I accepted an entry-level position with a marine technology startup in Miami, my mother's response was, "That sounds interesting. At least it's near the beach." I took the job anyway and packed my car once more, leaving the past folded neatly into boxes I didn't plan to reopen. Miami was a different kind of storm. The city pulsed with energy, full of people chasing ideas that barely existed yet. My first apartment overlooked Biscayne Bay, and though it was small, the sight of water each morning reminded me why I was there. Work was demanding, 12-hour shifts, low pay, endless trial runs of equipment that kept failing, but I loved it. Every time I dove beneath the surface to adjust a sensor, I felt connected to something larger and alive. The project focused on developing underwater devices that monitored salinity and temperature to track coral reef health. It was practical, data-driven work that could predict environmental changes before they turned into crises. Yet funding was scarce, and after the company lost a major investor, most of the team was let go. I stayed on a temporary contract, juggling freelance consulting jobs to make rent. The fridge often held more diving manuals than groceries, but quitting never crossed my mind. Michael checked in periodically, sometimes reviewing my field notes over coffee near the marina. He reminded me that all research began with survival, financial, mental, and literal. "Every storm clears space for what's meant to grow," he said, once his gaze fixed on the waves. I didn't believe him at the time, not fully, but his words would later become the cornerstone of everything I built. In the months that followed, I began sketching ideas for my own venture. I imagined a network of small, low-cost sensors lining the Florida coast, transmitting real-time data to predict erosion and flood risks. The name came easily, Blue Pulse Simple, direct a heartbeat for the ocean. I poured every spare dollar into prototypes working from my kitchen table. The process was slow, full of setbacks. One early test ended with every sensor swept away in a summer storm. I stood on the dock afterwards, soaked and defeated, watching fragments of my work wash ashore like driftwood. Rent was due that week, and I picked up part-time work as a diving instructor for tourists to stay afloat. The pay wasn't much, but teaching families how to breathe underwater brought me peace. The children's excitement reminded me of what first drew me to the ocean. Curiosity, not recognition. Late at night, I'd return home, empty my pockets of sand, and start soldering new circuit boards until dawn. I told myself that if I could just get one successful data set, everything else would follow. Then came a small conference at a community college in Miami, where I presented my findings to a half-empty room. I expected polite nods, maybe a few questions, but when I finished, a county representative approached me with a card. "We're working on coastal protection projects," she said. "Your system could fit into our pilot program." It felt like standing at the edge of a door that might finally open. Weeks later, after negotiations and paperwork I could barely afford to file, I secured my first official contract with Miami-Dade County. It wasn't huge, but it was enough to keep the lights on, and for the first time, Blue Pulse wasn't just an idea on paper. The contract led to another this time with a chain of resorts in the Keys worried about hurricane damage. They wanted data to help prepare for future storms. I spent months driving back and forth between Miami and the islands overseeing installations and calibrations. The work was demanding, but every check that cleared brought relief. For the first time, I could afford decent meals, a new wetsuit, and a proper laptop that didn't freeze mid-simulation. When my first payment arrived, I sat in my apartment staring at the balance on the screen. I didn't rush out to celebrate. I just breathed. The road had been long, full of small humiliations no one saw, and this moment felt like the quiet proof that I had been right to believe in myself. I thought about calling home, but stopped short. Experience had already taught me what the conversation would sound like. My father's distracted congratulations, my mother's comment about Paige's upcoming promotion. Instead, I called Grandma Ruth. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and steady. "You sound lighter," she said before I could even tell her why I was calling. I told her about the contract, how it could expand Blue Pulse beyond the local reefs. She laughed softly. "Your father will never admit it, but you're doing something special, Nora. Keep your head down and stay steady." Her faith was like a hand at my back, reminding me that not every part of my family had forgotten how to care. 3 years later, Blue Pulse had a small office, 5 employees, and clients along the eastern seaboard. Michael joined as a consultant, helping with the engineering side, while I handled contracts and investors. We weren't rich, but the company was stable, and for the first time I began to imagine a future that didn't feel fragile. When a venture capital firm offered to buy a portion of the company, I hesitated but agreed to sell a small share to fund expansion. The day the wire transfer arrived, I sat quietly at my desk, remembering the dock in Clearwater, where I once promised myself I'd build a different kind of life. The number on the screen represented years of solitude and stubborn faith. I closed the laptop and stepped outside. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and sunlight, and for a moment it felt like standing on the edge of possibility itself. That night, scrolling through property listings, I saw at a small island in the Upper Keys, less than 30 acres privately owned, ringed with mangroves and a weathered dock. The listing mentioned hurricane-resistant zoning and renewable energy potential. It wasn't just a property. It felt like the ending to a chapter I hadn't known was still open. I contacted the agent the next morning and set up a discreet meeting. Weeks of negotiations followed, hidden behind the name Bennett Tides LLC to keep my identity private. When I finally signed the paperwork, the agent slid the final folder across the table and said, "Congratulations, Ms. Bennett, you own an island." I smiled, not for the luxury, but for the peace it promised. I didn't buy it to show anyone. I bought it to remember what it felt like to belong to myself. The first time I set foot there, the sun was dropping low, casting a golden path across the water. The old dock creaked beneath my shoes, and the air smelled of cedar and salt. I walked inland, palms brushing my shoulders, until I reached a clearing where the light opened wide. It was quiet except for the rhythm of the tide. That evening, as I stood at the water's edge, I thought of every New Year's Eve I'd spent watching other people's fireworks from behind glass. I knew even then that the next time the world counted down, I wouldn't be waiting on anyone's list. The island became my refuge, my proof that solitude could be strength. It was where I drafted new blueprints and dreamed about what came next. But peace rarely goes untested. That December, just as I finished mapping new equipment routes, my phone buzzed with a message that pulled me back into an old ache. My mother's number flashed across the screen. "This year we're keeping it small, just Paige's side." I stared at the words, feeling the familiar chill in my chest. But something in me was different now. This time I didn't feel left out. I felt ready. The message from my mother stayed on my screen longer than it should have. "This year we're keeping it small, just Paige's side." The words didn't sting the way they once did. They simply confirmed what I already knew. I set the phone down on my desk and looked out the window toward Biscayne Bay. The sunlight flickered on the water, warm and steady, the same light that brushed the surface of the small island I had quietly bought months earlier. The distance between the two worlds felt wider than the miles that separated them. The following week I drove south to check on construction. Marcus Reed, the contractor overseeing the work, stood near the dock, going over blueprints when I arrived. He was tall, even-tempered, and spoke with the calm of someone who'd spent his life near the sea. "We reinforced the supports this morning," he said, handing me a clipboard. "By next week you'll be able to bring in a small yacht if you ever plan to." I nodded, tracing the lines of the structure with my eyes. It wasn't just a dock, it was an arrival point. Every plank and bolt felt like a quiet promise that I would never have to wait for someone else's welcome again. The main house had started to take shape, a frame of teak and steel rising against the horizon. I wanted it strong enough to face hurricane winds, but still warm and simple. Inside, I chose walls of glass so the ocean could spill its light into every corner. Marcus walked me through the layout, pointing to the solar panels waiting to be installed, and the backup generator nestled into a soundproof shed. "Once the filtration tanks go in, you'll be fully self-sufficient," he said. The words settled over me like a benediction. For the first time in my life, I was building something that didn't depend on approval. Weeks passed, with the rhythm of progress trucks arriving by ferry materials, offloaded sawdust filling the air. I spent long afternoons with Marcus reviewing codes and environmental permits, determined that every inch of the property would meet state regulations. It wasn't about extravagance. It was about control, about knowing that if I was ever left out again, it would be by choice. At the edge of the dock, I hung a bronze bell I'd found at a marine salvage shop. Its surface was weathered, its tone deep and rich. Along the side, I had the words, "Every toll marks a boundary crossed," engraved. When I rang it for the first time, the sound carried far across the water, steady and low. The vibration lingered in the air long after it stopped ringing. When the final inspection cleared, I stayed overnight on the island for the first time. The house smelled faintly of new wood and salt. I sat on the veranda, a blanket over my shoulders, watching the lights of fishing boats move across the dark water. The air was cooler there, quiet enough to hear palm fronds brushing against one another. For years, my New Year's Eves had been spent behind glass, watching fireworks explode over other people's laughter. Now I had no crowd, no noise, just the steady pulse of waves against the shore. It wasn't loneliness. It was peace. Early the next morning, I brewed coffee and called Grandma Ruth. Her voice came through soft but strong. "So you finally did it," she said. "A place of your own." I smiled, watching a heron sweep low over the bay. "Yes, and it's quiet here, Grandma. You'd love it." There was a pause on the other end before she said, "Quiet is good when it's earned, not given out of pity." I didn't answer. She understood without explanation. Later that afternoon, I called Aunt Diana in Nashville and my cousin Evan in Atlanta. They hadn't been invited to my parents' party either. Each conversation echoed the same quiet hurt. Maybe next year, they had been told. "It's just immediate family this time." I heard the disappointment in their voices, and something inside me shifted. For years, we had all accepted the same imbalance, pretending it didn't matter. But this time, it wasn't just me left off the list. It was nearly half the family. The pattern had finally outgrown the walls that contained it. That evening, sitting on the veranda, I opened my laptop and drafted a message. The idea came to me as the wind moved through the palms. I would host a New Year's Eve gathering, not out of revenge, but to rewrite what those nights had always meant. I reached out to a charter company in Coconut Grove, one I'd worked with before on coastal surveys. They confirmed availability of a 110-foot yacht, complete with safety crew and tender boats. The logistics began to unfold in my mind like blueprints. Every decision had to be deliberate. Every detail had to follow state and Coast Guard regulations. This wouldn't be a spectacle. It would be a declaration. Over the next several days, I assembled a plan that filled my office wall with notes. I booked a catering team that specialized in sustainable seafood, contracted 2 security guards, and ensured every guest would have a life jacket under Coast Guard code. I wrote out the liability forms myself, checked insurance coverage twice, and confirmed a licensed medical technician would be on board. If I was going to build a table for those left behind, it would stand on solid ground. When the invitations were ready, I sent each one electronically using a design that matched the simplicity of the island white background, a small wave logo, and a line beneath it that read, "If you've ever been left off a list, this table is for you." I didn't mention my parents or Paige. I didn't need to. Within minutes, my phone began to buzz. Grandma Ruth called first, her voice trembling. "You're doing this," she asked. "You're really doing it." I told her I was, and she started to laugh, low, warm laughter that sounded like relief. "Then count me in, sweetheart. I wouldn't miss it." Messages from the rest of the family followed quickly. Aunt Diana wrote, "I'm booking my ticket. Finally, a New Year's worth celebrating." Evan texted, "I'll bring the camera. Someone should document this properly." Hannah added a string of heart emojis promising to help with decorations. By the end of the day, nearly everyone who'd been left out had responded with some version of the same word, "finally." As I confirmed their attendance, I felt something I hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging, not borrowed or conditional, but earned through action. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about showing what could exist when people were treated as equals. That night, I returned to the island to finalize arrangements with Marcus, who had agreed to oversee lighting and safety once construction was complete. We stood by the dock reviewing the final power lines running from the generator to the veranda. "You're building something special here," he said, closing his notebook. "Most people buy an island to be alone. You're using it to bring people together." His words caught me off guard. I didn't answer, but I rang the bell again before leaving the sound rising above the wind. As December moved forward, the house transformed from a construction site into a home. I worked with a chef from New Orleans named Ray Butler, who promised to craft a menu filled with Gulf flavors, shrimp and grits, roasted oysters, and key lime tarts. For music, I contacted an old friend in Miami, a Latin jazz band leader named Sofia Delgado. She agreed to perform with her trio for the first half of the night, followed by a DJ to carry the crowd through the countdown. Everything had to blend the rhythm, the food, the light to create the feeling I'd never known growing up, that everyone, no matter their seat, belonged. A few days before Christmas, I received another email from my mother. It was short, the kind that carried more tone than words. "Don't work too hard, Nora. Paige is taking care of everything for our New Year's gathering. You should rest." I read it twice, smiling faintly. There was no anger left, only quiet understanding. She still didn't see that I had already built something far beyond her reach, not in wealth, but in peace. When the week before New Year's Eve arrived, the preparations were nearly done. The yacht was reserved, the music confirmed, the guest list finalized. Standing on the island at sunset, I looked around at what I had created. The palms swayed in rhythm with the waves' light strung across the veranda, swaying gently in the breeze. The bronze bell gleamed softly, catching the last gold of daylight. For a moment, I closed my eyes and listened to the hush between the waves, feeling the kind of calm that comes before a turning point. Soon, the countdown would begin again, but this time, the glass walls were gone. The next sound of celebration would not echo from a room that had forgotten my name. It would rise from the sea, carrying across the night toward anyone who'd ever been left standing outside the door. The final week of December moved faster than I expected. My office was covered in notes, contracts, and half-drained coffee mugs. Every morning I checked the countdown pinned to my wall, 5 days, then 4, then 3. Each number felt like another tide rolling in, carrying both anticipation and calm. The plans for the yacht, the island, the catering, the music, all of it was ready. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for permission to join the celebration. I was creating one. Ray Butler arrived in Miami 2 days before the event, sleeves rolled to his elbows, a grin as wide as the Gulf he came from. "You sure about cooking on a yacht?" he asked when I met him at the marina. "It's not your usual kitchen." I laughed, handing him the finalized event schedule. "It's the first time I've trusted someone else to feed my family," I said, and he nodded as if he understood more than I'd said out loud. Together, we went over the menu again: Gulf shrimp and grits, roasted oysters, fresh seaweed salad, and his signature key lime tarts. "You'll have the smell of home out there," he promised, tucking the list into his pocket. That evening, Sofia Delgado and her trio rehearsed on the dock, their brass instruments catching the fading light. The rhythm drifted across the marina, warm and inviting. They played a soft Latin jazz number that made the water shimmer as if even the waves were listening. When she finished, Sofia turned to me and smiled. "You don't need much to make people feel something," she said. "Just honesty and a good tempo." Her words stayed with me as I walked back to my car, the notes echoing behind me like an answer to an old silence. By the 30th, the island looked almost unrecognizable from the quiet refuge it had been just months before. String lights hung between the palms, soft and golden. Marcus's crew had finished the final checks on the generator and water systems, while I tested the bell one more time. Its tone rolled over the bay, deep and steady, a sound that carried more meaning than words ever could. I stood there for a moment thinking about every New Year's Eve that had passed while I watched through windows or waited for an invitation that never came. This time there would be no locked doors. That night I sent a final message to every guest. Dinner key. Marina 7:00 p.m. sharp. Boarding passes will be scanned at check-in. Bring your ID and bring your appetite. Replies started coming in almost immediately. Grandma Ruth sent 3 heart emojis followed by, "I'm bringing my sea legs." Aunt Diana texted, "We'll be early. Evan's in charge of photos." Even Hannah, who rarely traveled, wrote, "Got the ticket. I've been waiting years for this." The morning of December 31st dawned clear and warm. The marina buzzed with energy as the crew prepared, the yacht white decks, polished, safety gear checked twice, the captain reviewing his manifest. I stood near the gangway greeting guests as they arrived. Grandma Ruth was the first, wrapped in a soft blue shawl that fluttered in the wind. She handed her phone to the attendant for check-in, her eyes bright. "Never thought I'd see the day my name was printed on a guest list," she said softly, holding up the card that read, "Ruth Bennett, always a seat." I hugged her, feeling the weight of years lift between us. Evan came next, tall and quiet as ever. He didn't say much, just smiled and hugged me tight. "This," he said, motioning to the yacht, "is something I won't forget." Behind him, Aunt Diana arrived with 2 small suitcases, joking that she hadn't been on a boat since the 90s. When Hannah stepped up with her boarding pass, she laughed nervously. "I had to take a train a flight, and now a boat." "You better have dessert," she said, and I promised her we had more than enough. Once everyone boarded, the captain gathered us for a short safety briefing. His voice was calm, his tone professional, explaining flotation devices and emergency exits before giving a final nod to the crew. As the lines were released and the yacht began to drift from the dock, the hum of the engine blended with the rhythm of Sophia's music, starting softly on deck. The late sun painted the water in streaks of pink and gold, and Miami's skyline faded behind us. I looked around at the people leaning over the rails, laughing, watching the water ripple in the wake. These were the same faces that had once sat in the quiet corners of other parties waiting to be noticed. Tonight there was no corner, only one long horizon ahead. Dinner began just after sunset. The air smelled of butter and citrus, and the first plates that came from the galley drew applause. Grandma Ruth held up a fork and declared, "Now this is what I call a family tradition." The music softened as the jazz trio played in the background, and conversation flowed like a gentle current. No one was talking over anyone else. Every laugh, every story was shared, not performed. I moved between tables, making sure everyone had what they needed, and for the first time, I wasn't invisible at my own family's gathering. Halfway through the meal, Aunt Diana stood and tapped her glass. "I just want to say something," she began, her voice shaking slightly. For years I told myself I didn't care when we weren't invited. I told myself we had our own plans. But sitting here, I realize how much it hurt. Thank you, Nora, for reminding us that we still matter. A quiet fell over the table before Grandma Ruth reached over and squeezed her hand. "We always mattered," she said. "We just forgot to act like it." The hum of the engine softened as the yacht neared the island. The lights along the dock came into view, rows of soft gold leading toward the veranda. As we approached, I walked to the bow and took hold of the rope hanging beside the bell. When the yacht slowed to a stop, I pulled it gently, and the sound rang across the bay. It wasn't just a signal of arrival. It was the sound of every year I'd spent waiting, being released into the night air. The guests fell silent for a moment, then broke into applause that rolled like waves against the shore. One by one, we stepped onto the dock. The warm wood beneath my feet felt solid grounding. The path to the main house glowed with strands of light draped between palms. When we reached the veranda, the long table stood ready, white linen catching the reflection of the sea candles flickering in the breeze. The musicians set up in the corner, and the night unfolded in rhythm. Laughter blended with jazz, the clinking of glasses with the distant sound of waves. It was exactly what I had imagined, every seat filled, no one left on the sidelines. As the clock edged closer to midnight, the DJ took over, the tempo rising slowly. Ray appeared from the kitchen with trays of tarts, the scent of lime and sugar filling the air. I thanked him, and he grinned. "You weren't kidding about dessert being important," he said. I smiled back. "It's the only part that's sweet and safe to repeat." The final minutes of the year ticked down. Guests gathered near the edge of the veranda, eyes turned toward the horizon. The music swelled as I signaled to the fireworks team waiting on the north side of the island. The first burst rose into the sky, red and gold scattering over the waves. Cheers erupted as more followed, each reflection shimmering across the water like a mirror to everything we'd built together. The sound of laughter and applause filled the night, not forced but real, earned. As the countdown began, the music faded, replaced by voices joined in unison. 10, 9, 8. I found Grandma Ruth's hand and held it tight. 3, 2, 1. The sky exploded with light. Fireworks arched high, painting the darkness in streaks of silver and green. The cheers rose louder than the surf. Glasses clinked, and for a long moment no one moved. They just watched faces lit by the glow, breathing in the start of something new. When the last spark faded and the music picked back up, I stepped to the edge of the dock again, the bell's rope within reach. I didn't ring it this time. I just looked at the reflection of the moon on the water and listened. Behind me, voices filled the air, voices that had once been quieted, now strong enough to carry across the sea. For the first time, I wasn't counting down for anyone else. I was simply here, surrounded by the people who had been left out for too long, standing together at one table. And as the tide moved beneath the dock, I could feel the next chapter beginning to rise, carried by the sound of laughter and the promise of dawn. When the fireworks faded and the air settled back into the sound of waves, I stood at the end of the dock, still holding the rope of the bell. The guests were behind me, their laughter carrying across the water like music I'd never heard before. The smoke from the last firework drifted upward, soft and gray, leaving behind a quiet that felt sacred. For a moment I didn't move. The bell swayed slightly, its metal cool in my hand, and I watched its reflection ripple in the water. Every face tonight had been lit with real joy, not politeness or obligation, something rare, something earned. Inside the house, the celebration lingered. Sophia's band had shifted into slow jazz, her saxophone weaving through the night like a lullaby. The air was thick with the smell of lemon and salt from Ray's kitchen, and the veranda glowed with the gentle light of 100 candles. Grandma Ruth sat near the center of the table, her hands folded around a cup of tea, smiling at the people gathered around her. For once, no one was at a kid's table. Every person was part of the same circle, stories flowing freely from one end to the other. I slipped back inside, quietly taking a moment to watch from the edge. Aunt Diana was telling a story from her college days, and Evan laughed so hard he nearly dropped his glass. Hannah strummed a soft tune on a borrowed guitar. Even the younger cousins were relaxed, their laughter genuine instead of careful. There was no comparing, no spotlight, no one left waiting to be noticed. I realized this was what I'd been trying to create my whole life, a space where everyone could simply belong. Zoe, my youngest cousin, was managing the small media team I'd hired for the evening. They moved around the room, capturing moments, the sound of their camera shutters blending quietly with the music. When I passed her, she whispered, "Don't worry, I'm keeping everything respectful. Nothing goes live until you approve it." I nodded, grateful. She didn't know how right she was to be careful. I didn't need the night to go viral. I just wanted it to be real. Around midnight, the fireworks crew returned to gather their equipment. I walked them down to the North Beach, making sure everything was packed safely and that no embers remained on the sand. They were professionals certified by the county, but I checked every last detail anyway. Old habits die hard. The lead technician, a woman named April, gave me a tired smile. "You did something special here," she said as she loaded the final case. "Most events are all flash. This one, it meant something." Her words followed me back to the house. When I returned, Ray was stacking trays in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to his elbows, humming softly. "You look like someone who hasn't eaten all night," he said, handing me a plate with a slice of key lime tart. I laughed, sitting on the counter as I took a bite. "You might have just saved me," I said, and he grinned. "Food's supposed to do that, remind people they're cared for." The tart was tangy and bright, just enough sweetness to balance the salt still clinging to the air. I told him he'd outdone himself, and he chuckled. "Then we did it right," he said simply, packing up the last dish before heading toward the marina for the night ferry. As the last guests began drifting off to the guest rooms or back to the yacht for the return trip, I lingered outside with Grandma Ruth. The night was still, the water smooth as glass. She looked out toward the horizon, the lines in her face soft in the moonlight. "You've done what I never could," she said quietly. "You built something they couldn't take from you." I looked at her, unsure what to say, and she reached for my hand. "Don't let them undo this, Nora. Not when they come calling." Her words carried weight I didn't yet understand, but I held them close. When I finally went inside, the house was dim, the last of the candles flickering low. I turned off the lights one by one, walking through each room, slowly still feeling the pulse of the night beneath my skin. I stopped by the table where everyone had sat just hours before. Wine glasses stood half-full napkins, folded loosely beside plates. The air was heavy with warmth, the kind that lingers after something has changed. I gathered a few leftover coins I'd made for each guest, engraved with the year and a wave, and set one on the windowsill for myself. It gleamed softly in the moonlight. Just before sunrise, I heard my phone buzzing on the counter. Dozens of notifications scrolled across the screen, messages, calls, tags. I hadn't realized Zoe's team had already posted the highlight video. The clip was short, only 10 seconds long, the long table lit under the string lights, the fireworks bursting over the ocean, and Grandma Ruth sitting at the center smiling. The caption read, "Happy New Year from Morgan Island." I exhaled, a mix of pride and dread rising together. Within minutes, messages began pouring in faster. Most were from friends, colleagues, and extended family offering congratulations. Then came the ones I'd expected. My mother's name flashed first 3 missed calls. My father's followed, then Paige's. The messages came next. "Where is this? Why weren't we told? Is that your island? What are you doing?" The same tone I'd heard all my life, only sharper now that the spotlight wasn't theirs. I watched as their texts stacked one over another until the screen went white with alerts. Then I pressed and held my finger on the volume button until everything went silent. Outside, the first hint of dawn was painting the sky pale pink. I carried my coffee out to the dock and sat on the edge, the cool wood damp beneath my feet. For a long time, I just listened to the waves, to the faint hum of the generator, to the distant call of a seabird. Somewhere behind me, I could hear Grandma Ruth moving around the kitchen, humming softly. The house smelled faintly of coffee and salt air, familiar and grounding. When she joined me a few minutes later, she handed me another mug and sat beside me. "They're calling, aren't they?" she asked. I nodded. "Then let them wait," she said, taking a sip. "They've had their turn talking. It's your turn to be still." The simple truth of it settled between us. By the time the rest of the guests woke up, the sky was bright and the sea calm. I helped Ray's assistants load the leftover crates onto the tender boat and thanked Sophia's crew for their final set. Before leaving, she handed me a small envelope. "Something to remember tonight by," she said. Inside was a photo me standing at the head of the table, mid-laugh, fireworks blooming behind me. It was a good sound, she said softly, nodding toward the bell that still hung over the dock. That afternoon, after everyone had departed, the house grew quiet again. The long table was empty now, the glasses washed and stored away. I sat at the same spot where Grandma Ruth had been and opened my phone. Dozens more messages filled the screen, each one a variation of the same demand. "Explain yourself. Call us back. We need to talk." I let the screen go dark and set it face down on the table. The wind outside picked up, slightly rustling the palms. I walked to the door and stepped onto the veranda, the view stretching endlessly toward the horizon. I reached for the rope and pulled the bell, once the deep tone rolling out across the bay. It wasn't a call this time. It was an answer. The echo faded slowly, blending with the sound of the tide. Somewhere my family's phones were probably still buzzing, but here the air was calm. The island stood as it always had, steady and unbothered. I knew the next wave of confrontation was coming, calls, explanations, perhaps even guilt, but I wasn't afraid of it. For the first time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The sun dipped low that evening, casting the dock in gold. I stood there until the last light disappeared, knowing that by morning the silence would break, and when it did, I would no longer be the daughter waiting outside the door. The next morning arrived quiet and clear, the sea as smooth as a pane of glass. I made coffee early, walking barefoot across the veranda, while the light crept over the horizon. The island looked untouched, as if the night before had been only a dream, no music, no laughter, just the slow rhythm of waves brushing the shore. But my phone on the table reminded me it had all been real. Missed calls. Dozens of them. The screen filled again within minutes, each notification flashing a familiar name. I sat down watching the sunlight climb the edge of the dock. My parents had never called that many times in their lives. The silence between us had always been the rule, and now they were breaking it in panic. Another message came in Paige this time. Call us now. We need to talk about what you did. I set the phone face down, taking another slow sip of coffee. Their urgency didn't surprise me. For years they had owned the story of every family gathering. This time they weren't in control. By mid-morning, Grandma Ruth found me outside and handed over a folded towel. "You're about to get a storm," she said. I smiled faintly. "You think they'll come?" She nodded, her eyes soft but certain. They can't stand being left out of their own reflection. Her words settled between us like mist. She didn't need to explain. I knew exactly what she meant. 2 hours later, a charter boat appeared on the horizon, white hull, cutting clean through the blue water. Even from a distance, I could see my mother's hair pulled into a tight bun, my father's stance rigid beside her. Paige followed behind, phone in hand, filming the island as they approached. I stayed by the dock waiting while Marcus's crew, who had come to check the generator, quietly gathered their tools and moved out of sight. When the boat reached the pier, my father was the first to step off. His shoes hit the dock hard like punctuation. "What is this?" he demanded, gesturing toward the house. "Do you have any idea how this looks?" "People are talking." My mother trailed behind, her voice sharper than the salt wind. "We woke up to calls, Nora. Photos, videos, everyone saw it online. That party. How could you embarrass us like this?" I let them finish before speaking. "It wasn't about you," I said calmly. "It was about everyone who's been left out for years." My mother shook her head, incredulous. "That video made us look heartless. You made our family sound—" She stopped herself. My father stepped closer, his tone heavy with authority. "You could have called. We could have handled this privately." I looked at him the same way I used to look through glass at those New Year's parties long ago. "You've handled everything privately my whole life," I said quietly. "All I did was show what's been hidden." Paige finally stepped forward, her phone now tucked away, her voice low but firm. "Do you know what you've done to Mom's reputation? Her friends think you were making a statement excluding us on purpose." I met her eyes, steady and unflinching. "I didn't exclude you, Paige. You weren't invited because you never invite anyone else. I just followed the pattern." Her face tightened, and for the first time she didn't have an answer. The air between us was thick, every unspoken year pressing down at once. My father's voice softened, perhaps sensing that command no longer worked here. "We made mistakes," he said. "Families drift. But this was cruel, Nora." I turned toward the house, gesturing to the long table still set from the night before. Cruel was watching everyone else toast without me. For 30 years, I said. Cruel was pretending not to notice. For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the waves filled the silence. Then Grandma Ruth stepped forward from the veranda, her cane tapping against the boards. "That's enough," she said firmly. "You can't accuse her of cruelty when you were the ones holding the door shut." My mother's mouth opened, then closed again. Ruth's voice, though soft, carried more weight than any raised tone. "You left me off that list, too," she continued. "Did you think I wouldn't remember I've been at that table since before either of you knew how to pour champagne? And you stopped seeing me when I stopped fitting your picture." My father's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to my mother, but she said nothing. Grandma Ruth took a slow breath and turned to me. "You did what I couldn't," she said. "You showed them what it feels like to be unseen." I nodded once, grateful for her strength, though my hands trembled slightly at my sides. Paige looked between us, her expression caught somewhere between anger and realization. "So this is it?" she asked. "You just cut us off. You think this fixes anything?" I stepped closer, my tone even. "No, Paige. I didn't do this to fix anything. I did it to stop pretending it was already fixed." For the first time, the island was completely quiet. Even the breeze seemed to pause. My mother turned away, blinking fast as if trying to hold her composure. My father's voice broke the silence again, lower now. "You've made your point," he said. "But someday you'll regret doing this publicly." I met his eyes, the same gray-blue as the sea behind him. "The only thing I regret is waiting this long to stand up. They left soon after boarding the charter without another word. The sound of the motor faded into the distance, leaving only the soft lap of water against the dock. Grandma Ruth stayed beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "They'll spin their own version," she said. "Let them. The truth doesn't need defending." I nodded, watching the horizon blur in the heat. That afternoon, I walked through the house, replaying the conversation in my mind. The tension still clung to the air, heavy but not unbearable. On the table, my phone vibrated again, dozens of new notifications. This time, though, they weren't from family. They were from people who had seen the video and recognized themselves in it. Strangers writing messages that began with words like "thank you," and finally someone said it. I scrolled for a moment before setting the phone aside. The message had already reached further than I ever intended. Later, Marcus arrived to check the dock and generator one last time. He noticed the lingering tension in my shoulders, but didn't ask about it. Instead, he looked out at the water and said, "You handled that better than most could." I smiled faintly. It wasn't a performance. He nodded, his voice quiet. That's why it worked. As the sun dipped low, I walked to the end of the dock one more time. The bronze bell hung still, its surface glowing faintly in the orange light. I gripped the rope and let it swing once the tone deep and steady rolling out across the bay. Behind me the house stood tall and quiet, no longer a secret, no longer a refuge hiding from the world. It had become something else entirely, proof that silence could end without bitterness, that truth could be told without rage. The echo of the bell lingered in the air long after the sound faded. I watched the horizon until dusk turned to darkness, the water mirroring the first stars of the night. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, headlines, phone calls, explanations. But tonight I had peace. And for the first time, the word family didn't hurt when I said it out loud. The weeks after my parents' visit passed quietly. The world moved on, though the ripples of that night continued to spread in ways I hadn't expected. News outlets picked up the story after the video went viral, the daughter who built her own table. One headline read, "I didn't seek it out, but it found me anyway." Messages poured in from strangers across the country, people who'd been left out of their families, who saw themselves in my story, who said it reminded them that it wasn't too late to start over. I answered only a few, mostly the ones that sounded like someone simply needed to be heard. One woman from Oregon wrote, "You gave me the courage to stop begging my parents to see me." I wrote back, "You were always visible. They just forgot how to look." After that, I closed my inbox and went back to work. My company Blue Pulse had grown steadily during all this, but I kept it out of the spotlight. The island remained my refuge, not my reward. By early spring, life found a calm rhythm again. The tides shifted as they always did, and the mangroves around the island thickened with new growth. Grandma Ruth stayed a few weeks longer than planned. Every morning we sat on the veranda drinking coffee and watching the pelicans skim the water. She seemed lighter here, free from the performances she'd been expected to keep up for years. Sometimes she told stories from when she was young, how she'd once dreamed of moving south and running her own inn near the water. "I guess you're doing that now," she said one morning, laughing softly. "Only better." A month later, she flew home to Savannah with promises to visit again. When her plane lifted off, I stood on the dock and listened to the sound of the bell echo faintly in the distance. It had become my way of marking time, not with calendars or holidays, but with the quiet toll of moments that mattered. One evening, I received an email from Paige. The subject line was simple: "I'm sorry." Inside, she wrote that our parents had been struggling since the confrontation, but that she'd started to see things differently. "I thought you embarrassed us," she wrote. "Now I realize you showed us what family is supposed to look like." Attached was a photo from her new apartment in Jacksonville, smaller, simpler, with no trophies or framed awards, just sunlight through white curtains and a small plant on the sill. I replied the next morning, "You don't have to apologize for growing up in the same house. You just have to keep growing." A few weeks later, she called. Her voice was hesitant but honest. "Mom's been asking about you," she said. "I think she wants to talk." I told her I wasn't ready for that yet, and she understood. "I'll tell her you're doing okay," she said before hanging up. For the first time in years, I believed her. As spring turned to summer, I opened the island again, not for a party this time, but for something quieter. Blue Pulse had partnered with the county on a new coastal research program, and we invited students from local universities to spend a weekend studying the surrounding reefs. Watching them work, measuring currents, logging data, laughing under the sun, I felt something settle inside me. The place that had once symbolized solitude had become a space for learning, community, and hope. On the final day of their visit, one of the students, a young woman named Lily, asked if I ever felt lonely living here. I thought for a moment before answering. "Not anymore," I said. "Loneliness happens when you wait for people to hand you a seat. Peace comes when you build your own." She smiled, and I could tell she understood. That night after the students left, I sat by the dock with a lantern and my notebook. The tide was high, the air warm and still. I wrote down a single sentence. Every year I was left out taught me how to let myself in. Then I closed the book and looked toward the horizon. The following New Year's Eve, I hosted another gathering, smaller this time. Grandma Ruth returned, Paige came too, and even my parents accepted the invitation after months of silence. When their boat arrived, I met them halfway down the dock. No speeches, no apologies, just a quiet nod between us. The air felt different, not strained but tentative, like a new tide testing the shore. We ate together under the same string lights as before, and though conversation came slowly, it came naturally. At midnight, when the bell rang, my mother reached over and took my hand. She didn't say a word, but the gesture was enough. Later that night, as the guests slept and the last candles burned low, I walked outside one last time. The sea was calm, the stars scattered bright across the sky. I rang the bell softly, the sound carrying far into the darkness. It wasn't about triumph anymore. It was gratitude, plain and quiet. Gratitude for the silence that taught me strength, for the distance that taught me peace, and for the family I had found by choosing truth over comfort. If you've ever been the one standing outside the door, waiting for someone to notice you, I hope this story reminds you, you don't have to wait forever. You can build your own place, open your own door, and fill it with the kind of love you always deserved. And if this story found you tonight, take a moment to share it with someone who might need it too. Sometimes that's how new tables get built. One story, one seat, one quiet act of courage at a time.